Sarah Miller, welcome to episode number 35 of the podcast here. It's awesome to have you in.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks for coming on. I will say I emailed you before the episode for some talking points in terms of what you teach in Latin, because that's not the most familiar topic for me. So if I ask any stupid questions or dumb questions on the podcast here, please feel free to educate me.
Well, I always tell my students there are no dumb questions in a Latin classroom or a Greek classroom, because we can find something that's definitely not dumb about it. So,
what are the classes that you teach here, and maybe what are some of the subject matters that you go over in your classes?
So I teach Latin and Greek this year. So I teach beginning Greek 1, and then I teach beginning Latin, and then Latin 2 honors and Latin 3 honors this year. So we mostly are language focused as a department. We do what's in sort of Latin speak, the sort of more traditional grammar translation method in our style of teaching. But the goal is to get our students reading actual Latin eventually, or Greek that was written by the ancients at a certain point, as soon as we can. So,
yeah, one of my favorite things to do is go to art museums, and I always wish that I took some Latin. Growing up, I took Spanish, but if I knew a little bit of Latin, I could actually make sense of some of the things that I'm seeing in museums.
Yeah,
I think that's part of the usefulness of taking a class like that, right?
Yeah, and it's like if you go to Europe and you're just traveling, walking around any European city, you'll stumble across inevitably some sort of inscription, probably in Latin, sometimes in Greek, depending where you are. And it is kind of cool when you're like, oh, I can read that, or like, I know there's pleasure in that. It's like, oh, I can figure it out. So
for sure.
Yeah.
And you've done a solid amount of travel in Europe, right?
Mostly related to classics. So, like in undergrad, I did short study abroads to, like we had 3-week extended studies. I went to Colgate University for undergrad. So we did these 3-week extended studies to Rome and then Greece. And then in graduate school, I spent basically a whole school year in Greece with the American School of Classical Studies at Athens, which is an overseas research sort of institute for American universities and colleges. And they run this year-long program for graduate students to really dive into the history, the archaeology of Greece, but not just ancient Greece. Basically, we went from like prehistory to modern-day Greece. We learned it all, and we went everywhere, which was awesome.
And you were there for a full year?
Basically, school year, so like 9 months. So,
oh, cool.
Yeah. And
you got to do an archaeological dig over there, right? That's what you said? Yeah,
as part of one of the options, like in the spring, like they have these, in the spring program, after like traveling all around Greece, you have some sort of independent options. You can do these trips that are outside of Greece, but sort of connected to the Greek world. So my year, the options were Egypt and Southeast Turkey, Cilicia. So I went on that trip, which was awesome because it was probably some places I would never go by myself. And then you could also choose to work for 3 weeks at the archaeological dig in ancient Corinth. So I chose that for 3 weeks and then chose to go to Southeast Turkey as my other option.
Why'd you choose the dig? What was so fascinating to you about the archaeological aspect of that trip?
So my whole training at that point, I'm what you would call like a philologist. I'm interested in language, literature. That was my whole background in classics in both undergrad and graduate school. So I wanted that opportunity to experience an archaeological dig, to sort of see sort of my field from a different perspective. And also the whole program that I went for that whole year was great for that, because I was exposed to things outside of because normally I'm more interested in Latin. I'm more of a Latinist, so it was great to just get the broad exposure of fields that I wasn't either as knowledgeable or as comfortable in. So the archaeological dig I really wanted to do it because it was probably going to be my only opportunity ever to go on an archaeological dig.
Right.
So I chose that, and it was good. And I learned I chose correctly, like maybe archaeology was not for me, but I also learned a ton, and I really enjoyed I really got to experience how we figure out history, how we construct a historical narrative, because the way they dig at Corinth at that time was some digs you dig as the human, like today we dug 2 inches this is what we found in the context.
Mm-hmm.
But here we were forced to write our narrative reports of like, in the 13th century AD, the person in this place dug a post hole.
Mm-hmm.
So we were constructing a narrative as part of our reports, and I really enjoyed that aspect because I could really, like, I was constructing history at that point from based on what we were finding that day. So that I found really intriguing and interesting.
What kinds of things would you find when you're out there digging? How many people were in the program with you?
So for that like session, so there were, I think, about 6 of us graduate students. And then in ancient Corinth, they have an interesting archaeological dig because they have local Greeks, local Corinthian residents who, and it's like their father and their grandfather and their great-grandfather have all worked on this archaeological dig since its inception in like, I think late 1800s or early 1900s, I forget exactly the time period. So they have this long history, tradition of the Greeks being sort of the diggers, which is a bit irregular because most archaeological digs you're also doing the digging, so that's just an interesting place where I myself was not actually doing the digging. There were Greeks, but the useful thing for them, because they're so experienced, they really know the soil, and then as soon as the soil changes, they know, oh, we're in a different time period now. So they could easily tell, like, because the way people live, it's not straight levels. It was depending on if they're building or something happened, like the time frame could change constantly. We were all doing it based on soil, basically. So
fascinating.
Yeah.
Anything that you remember that you found when you were digging, or what are some of those objects or artifacts that you dug up?
Yeah, so we were working in, I think it was a sort of a Frankish period. So that's my dates are probably going to be terrible because I haven't thought about this in a while. So Frankish, I think we probably started around a level around, I don't know, 1300 AD. And please, someone can correct me if this is totally wrong because I'm misremembering it, I'm sure. And we were hoping to, I remember for my 3-week session, we were hoping to get down to the Roman level. We didn't quite make that. But like the things we were finding were mostly what we call small finds. So it was like coins. So those were always interesting because we would find a coin and then we would have to then figure out like what time period is the coin from and things like that for dating purposes. You dig up a lot of potsherds and you actually date most of the levels that you're digging in based on those potsherds because the pottery changes over time and they know what time period each of the pottery and where the pottery is coming from. So that's how they did a lot of the dating. I wasn't fortunate, but the group next to me, they found a well. So that's always great when you hit a well because
wow,
you find all sorts of things at the bottom of the well. So they found some beautiful pottery that they were pulling out of it and things like that. So we didn't have any major finds during my 3-week session, but still, it was good experience and it's always exciting because you do just mostly you dig up like potsherds, animal bones, things like that. And then more and more we can use those animal bones and the potsherds to really date and understand what the people were doing at that time and sort of what was the living conditions. So
Interesting. How did you develop such a fascination or an interest for classics? Where did all of this originate for you in your academic career?
So in 6th grade is when we learned ancient history.
Me too. I had a great teacher, Mr. Verno. He was...
Yeah, I had Mrs. Schneider. So we did like ancient Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. We even did a 6th grade play about like King Tut, which was awesome and fun. So that was like my first exposure really to sort of the ancient world. And then we went to Greece and Rome. And because I couldn't really study hieroglyphics like in school, but going into middle school in 7th grade, I went to public school. So at that point, middle school started in 7th grade. I could choose a language and Latin was one of the options. So I immediately signed up for that because I just loved learning about the ancient world in 6th grade. And I thought this would be my closest way to continue that interest.
Do you think it was the subject matter that immediately attracted you, or was it that teacher that really played a key role in your fascination with the subject?
Probably
a little both.
A little bit of both, maybe, yeah. Because she was really that was also the year like we could every year we could kind of do this, but she really had a library in our classroom, and we were encouraged just to pick books at random to read. And there was a bit of sort of goal incentive, like if you read a certain number of books, you would get like certain rewards or something for doing that. So like I also always had enjoyed reading, so like that sort of environment sort of set me up to like really enjoy her in the class, both learning the subject matter but also just enjoying reading even more. So I think it probably a bit of both for sure.
So you continued to study Latin through high school, and when you went to Colgate, did you know immediately you wanted to dive more deeply into the classics?
So I had originally, going into my freshman year, or when I was even applying to college, I was like I enjoy Latin, but I would like to do, I was thinking like, like high schoolers have big dreams, like I want to go out in the world and I want to sort of, I don't know, be an important person and get into business. But when I got my course catalog to pick courses going into freshman year, they have a freshman seminar at Colgate, so you pick sort of, it's basically topic themed. There's things like the cryptology or the advent of the atomic bomb or things like that. And the one that drew me most was like the gods of the poets, which was taught by a classics professor, and it was about philosophy and like Homer and literature and sort of what was influencing poetry and things like that. So that is what influenced me. And then one of my first friends at Colgate, she said when she saw that description, she was like, no way. So I think that also sort of immediately what I was interested in revealed itself. And then I didn't take Latin my first semester. I took French because I was like, I should probably take a modern language at some point. So I took French for my first semester, but then I added Latin back in my spring semester. And then the classics classes were the ones that were most interesting to me at that point. And then it just snowballed from there. So
awesome. Yeah, it's such a unique interest that you had going into it. And maybe it was the subject matter in sixth grade or something else that attracted you to it. But it's cool that you kind of had an idea of what you wanted to do from a really early age, sixth grade.
Yeah, well, it's not maybe what I wanted to do, but what I was interested in.
Yeah.
Because I was also not even sure if I wanted to continue like with graduate school or whatnot, because it's a tough road to sort of going in through graduate school and like trying to earn a Ph.D. But then like again, as through college, like I did some internships, but what I most enjoyed was like being at school, being in college, and then also to a certain extent growing to like teaching and sort of instructing, because my senior year I was like an undergraduate TA for like elementary Latin, so that kind of all snowballed over time.
What was that experience like as a first time teaching?
It was interesting. Well, we were mostly used as graders to a certain extent. So we would grade homeworks, and then we would have like tutoring hours. So sometimes the students would come, and it was interesting, like suddenly having to explain to someone else what you already know. Was you suddenly realize, oh, like you have to really think through, like, because sometimes when you're good at something, you just learn it. You don't really know how you do it, or you haven't thought about then how do you explain that to someone else. You just kind of understand it. So that was sort of my first, oh, right, like you have to really think through how someone learns, and they may learn it differently from you. So you have to try different approaches. So that was my kind of first experience with that. Yeah,
you really have to understand your subject matter if you're going to simplify it for someone else.
Yeah, and I had an earlier experience, like all through high school, I played clarinet. And I was kind of mostly quote unquote a band geek throughout high school. So and at one point I was considering music education for college instead of going into a more traditional liberal arts college. And so I would sometimes tutor younger students, like elementary age students when I was in high school with clarinet. And that was similar, like suddenly like, I figured it out, but how do you get someone else to figure it out how to produce those sounds and things like that? So I did like that sort of the puzzle aspect, but also the reward when they do get something, like that enjoyment that you see the breakthrough on a student was quite like thrilling. So
yeah, that's pretty cool. That's similar to, I think, my path to teaching too, was doing lacrosse lessons with little kids, and I was like, this is pretty fun teaching younger kids, what I like to do. And then you always had the passion for Latin and classics with you too, so it's almost like a combination of those two things.
Yeah.
So let's talk maybe about graduate school for you and what that experience was like and how really you found Gilman and teaching here after that.
So I graduated from Colgate, and then I immediately went to UVA for graduate school for the classics program, for the Ph.D. program. And it was intense. My Greek was not as strong as my Latin, and that came out in my graduate level classes. So I had to really work at that and work at my Latin as well. So graduate school, depending where you go, it can be a really sort of encouraging time, but it also can be stressful because there's tons of requirements, the exams, and sort of just the stress of it all. And there's not a guaranteed job at the end. And so that was becoming apparent because I think my second year was like 2008 when the economy collapsed. So that became apparent. But I did enjoy my classes, and I was really fortunate that our program, all the graduate students got along and really helped each other. I found some great friends there because you would hear horror stories at other graduate programs where each graduate student was out for themselves. And they would actually sabotage each other. So I was so thankful to not be in that kind of environment. So like over the years at UVA, like I was so thankful to be in that program because I learned so much. It pushed me to my limits. And I met some wonderful people, like my closest friends, and also just some great mentors over the year. But I also got to teach a lot. So UVA, which was kind of maybe different than some other graduate programs, after your first year, starting your second year, you start TAing or teaching. And sometimes you're a TA where you're like teaching like smaller sections of a larger like beginning Latin course or a Greek mythology course. But you could also have your full course as the instructor. So getting that experience was just wonderful because I was able to teach various levels of Latin. I was able in the summers to teach my own like Greek myth course and my own Roman civilization course. So through those years, I was really able to develop and hone like how I wanted to be as a teacher and my skills.
So when you first were admitted to this program, and for the people in your class with you, were most of your goals to become teachers and teach after and enter education, or what really is the motivator for a lot of the students who apply to a program like this?
The number one motivator is you want to become a college professor. Is really, if you're going into a PhD in classics, you want to become a professor. But the reality is that there's very few jobs for professors in almost any humanities field, but maybe particularly in classics, but also even now in like the sciences, there's only so many positions at colleges. So over the years, especially in the last 5 years or 5 to 10 years maybe, there's been a big push in academia about like sort of alternative academics for PhDs, like where it's not a terrible thing if you don't end up as a professor, but there's other career opportunities out there for you. And that's been a big movement within academia to like, because being a professor cannot be the end-all goal because there's just so many people will fail. So, yeah.
So what are some of those alternatives? Is maybe in like high school and independent schools? Is that are those programs seeing a lot of their graduates going into those professions too, and kind of the secondary school world?
Well, it's also interesting because some students or people enter these PhD programs. They may not actually even enjoy teaching. They don't quite know. What they enjoy is reading Latin and Greek. They love research. They love writing about what they're studying and reading. They may not necessarily have thought, well, what about teaching? But of course, a college professor, you have to be able to teach nowadays to students. And it's not just your research, although depending where you are, so much of your job performance depends on your research. So that was always interesting because you could tell like which students maybe were not in it for the teaching, whereas I learned pretty quickly like actually the teaching was the part I most enjoyed, so it made sense that I would transition into an independent school world where the teaching would be the focus. Also, I'm not personally set up for publish or perish. I'm a very slow writer, so I was not going to be able to survive kind of trying to publish things anyways, so. But it was good that I enjoyed the teaching. So
for sure. I mean, It's great that you found that out during your academic experience, what was the subject matter within classics that most fascinated you during your time there?
So I have always enjoyed Latin prose, so not the poetry. Although I enjoy reading Latin poetry, it's not something that sort of really enthused me as a research topic. So I made it all the way through my Ph.D. exams. I went to Greece for a year, and then I was coming back and then starting my dissertation. So I was planning to work on Cicero, who's the great Roman statesman at the end of the Roman Republic. So we have from him a huge corpus of letters. And it's because of these letters, actually, that's one of the reasons why we know so much about the late Roman Republic, because he's those letters have been used as a historical source, because they're partly personal letters, partly written, meant to be read widely at the same time. So you could learn. We have been able to learn a lot about Cicero from that time period.
What made Cicero such a great statesman or lawyer or orator? He was one of the greatest speakers ever, right? How did he hone that craft, and what were his speeches like?
Yeah, so Cicero's about the same age as Julius Caesar. So Cicero's born in 106 BC and Caesar's born in 100. So they overlap in time period. And even though it's not spoken much about, Caesar's also supposed to be a very good orator. So Cicero is born, he's an equestrian, so his family prior to him has not had anyone reach the consulship in Rome in sort of the highest level of government. So Cicero is considered a sort of a new man. He's the first one in his family to reach the highest office in ancient Rome as the consul. And so he gets his name because he's able to be elected to each office at the age that he becomes eligible, which is also remarkable. That as soon as he hits the age requirement, he gets elected to the office and he climbs the ladder. And then a lot of his speeches are sort of, he makes his name in court cases. So he defends the poet Archias is one of them, who is not a Roman citizen, but he's a poet. He's a Greek poet, and he defends him with citizenship questions. Is sort of one of his speeches. And then the sort of famous speeches are when the year of his consulship are the Cataline Conspiracy. So Cicero, as consul that year, defeats a coup attempt by Cataline. And so there's a series of 4 speeches that he gives to the Roman Senate and to the Roman people, where he sort of defends the power of the Republic and the Senate and whatnot. So those are some of those famous speeches, but there's many of them. He has a lot, and he is very conscious in getting his speeches published as a way to sort of craft his legacy. He's very conscious of that so that's why we have so many things surviving from him, because it's clear he was really thinking about what would his legacy be.
And he became very wealthy over the course of his life, right? He was wealthy. He was maybe thinking a lot about his legacy and leaving his speeches behind. How about the letters, though? Because that's something that I hadn't really known much about. What have you found out in all of your studies about Cicero's letters, or what can we find out about him through those letters?
So the letters are interesting because we have from authors like correspondences. We always, I think, famous authors, I think there's probably Hemingway and things like that. We learn a lot about them. Cicero's letters, there's always a question. They're similar to that. They're letters that have survived. But also the culture at the time was letters would be sent and then read aloud. So they weren't meant necessarily to be just private. They were often written, depending on who you were writing to, with the expectation that the person would read that and then pass it along to his circle of friends or circle of political acquaintances. So these letters, they're not just these casual private correspondence. We know that some of them are meant to be shared widely.
That's bizarre. It's like sending a text message today and knowing that your friend's going to read it to all of the people he's with.
Yeah, exactly. So what I was interested in the letters was looking at approaching more as sort of literature, like looking at patterns of speech or how patterns of argument. So in particular, I was looking at the sort of motif of an apologia, an apology, meaning not an apology like we think of today, like forgiveness, but an apology as in a defense. So defending oneself against accusations. Sort of how that language was maybe similar or different, or the patterns Cicero used in his letters would be similar or different to how he would defend his actions in his speeches. So
kind of like a counter argument, like he's identifying the potential counter arguments already in his speeches, right? That's like a form of strong writing, I think. Is like in English we teach to, acknowledge the counterpoints and button those up before you're attacked, maybe something like that.
Yeah, both before and after. Like if you've been accused of something, how do you respond? How do you defend yourself? And sort of what I didn't get very far into my dissertation before I transitioned totally into teaching. But I was looking at his letters of consolation, because there's a series of letters where, because Cicero's daughter dies in childbirth. And then we have also Cicero's correspondence is great because we also have letters not from Cicero, from other people that survive. So he gets some consolations back, but a lot of them are, they console him for his daughter, but they also say, like, you need to get out beyond your grief, because Cicero famously grieves for his daughter pretty seriously, which is maybe not, was typical of an expected response in the ancient world from a male member, which unfortunately has carried on to modern times to a certain extent. Like, you shouldn't show your grief too much. But Cicero famously was very saddened by his daughter's death. So he gets these letters, but they are often like, you need to sort of look past your grief. So he writes these responses back where he's defending that he shouldn't be criticized for the way he's feeling.
That's interesting. Yeah. Because we were talking on a previous episode about what is the stereotype that men don't cry, and like that, how that permeates in our society and our cultures. Is that a natural thing? Is it, are we kind of born like as males to hide our emotions in some ways, or is that something that's determined or put onto us by society? And I think that's a difficult question, but it's interesting that Cicero was he defended himself for something that makes total sense.
Right. And it is a bit of societal pressure, because even at that time there's this sort of more Stoic philosophy, like you should sort of just bear up under these blows of fortune, and he's like, he needs to process his grief in a different way. And he does this actually through a philosophical work. It's the Tusculan Disputations, which I'm not as familiar about or remember as much about, but he even goes through a philosophical work discussing grief and loss. So it was a big sort of moment that was weighing on him. So
yeah, I've looked into the Stoic philosophers of this time period a little bit too. There's this guy, I don't know if you know, Ryan Holiday is kind of become popular, and he's written a couple of books recently. But he talks a lot about Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus.
The second.
The second?
Yeah.
And then one more I'm drawing a blank on, but the Stoic philosophy, have you studied that much? Do you study that much in your classes at all, or no?
I didn't study as much philosophy. I read, we always read Plato, but we were always approaching Plato more in my classes through more of a sort of historical and literature perspective, even though the philosophy is there to talk about. But so I hadn't really read a lot of Marcus Aurelius or anything, but mostly the philosophy I've read has actually been through Cicero, because so much of those sort of earlier philosophical schools, the academics, the Stoics, a lot has been sort of Cicero translating the Greek into Latin, and through his philosophical works, he's a source for a lot of the Greek philosophy into the Latin language. So he comes up with the language for talking about these philosophical schools in Latin. So
gotcha. Was Cicero highly regarded and respected during his time, or did he have segments of his populace who didn't like him so much.
Yes. So he famously saves the Republic, but then he gets exiled for that because it's the end of the Roman Republic, and suddenly we have these tensions which lead to the civil war between Caesar and Pompey. Cicero is kind of caught up in the middle of that. So he gets exiled for a year because he famously saves the Republic, but he executes the perpetrators without trial. And so when later sort of the different political factions are sort of stirring up trouble, Cicero's actions immediately come to the forefront. He gets exiled for a year, and then he eventually is brought back, which is a great thing, but from that point he's never as powerful, maybe, or he feels he now has to constantly be working on his reputation from that point on. So it's all mixed up with the tensions of the late Roman Republic, and sort of there's only so many spots to rise to power in ancient Rome based on the governmental system. But when you have two huge figures like Caesar and Pompey with tons of money and clout, suddenly everything, there's this like bottleneck, and that's what leads sort of this eruption of the sort of civil war, which had been building for 100 or so years at that point. So
in your classes, do you I'm sure you study Cicero's writings in the classes you teach here, or
actually
not so much?
No, because sort of the texts we use are kind of, especially in some classes, are based on like the AP curriculum, so we choose certain texts to build up to that. When I used to teach the course Latin 4, and sometimes I would read some Cicero letters with the students there. So I actually haven't had, since coming to Gilman, the opportunity to teach Cicero that much, but I keep thinking about maybe ways I can fit him more in. He's notoriously kind of difficult for especially elementary level or beginning intermediate readers, because he has these long sentences with tons of clauses. So you have to really pay attention to what's going on, because you don't hit the main verb often until like 5 lines from the start of the sentence. So so getting students to enjoy that, to like have the patience to wait for the sentence to end, is something I still also need to work on, to be able to teach that and really to share why this is great Latin writing. So that I keep meaning to add that in, and hopefully at some point I can figure out how to really incorporate Cicero more into my classes and my teaching. So
yeah, that would be awesome, because it's a unique aspect of what you study that you're really interested in.
Yeah.
What is it about Cicero that you personally admire the most, or what do you think has attracted you to studying him so much?
I'm not sure if it's mostly admire, because like they always say like, who would you want to eat dinner with? And I feel like Cicero actually would be really annoying to eat dinner with, because
huge ego,
yeah. So but I enjoy the letters in particular, because you can really, and in general I've always enjoyed sort of the idea of letters as both a literary form of writing and also a construct, because they seem so personal, but they are often clearly not. They're conveying something else that is being meant to be shared. So I liked Cicero because he just offers such a wealth of knowledge into that time period, but you can also feel closer to him through his letters. Like you really see him as a person, both the flaws and the positives, because you see the flaws when you read the letters. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So even though he knew people were going to be reading his letters, he wasn't shy about putting, being more human in them and showing his flaws.
Yeah, and some of the letters maybe were not as meant to be widely shared. They are more personal, but they're put into this collection with the rest of them. So like we see these letters to his wife that he eventually divorces, and it's funny if you trace the letters to his wife over the time period, they get shorter and shorter as the divorce is approaching. So that's kind of...
Was divorce common in that day?
Yes, especially in the upper classes, because marriage was used as political alliance tools. So famously, I can't believe I'm blanking on the names, but someone divorced their wife so the wife could marry their sort of political rivals so they could have a connection and alliance.
Oh, wow.
And then when the other person died, the wife then came back to the first husband.
Crazy.
So, yeah.
Well, this is... I think I need to sit in on one of your classes because, again, I do not know. The timeline is totally foreign to me. You know, it's something that I would need to take a class on. But Cicero is an interesting figure for sure, and complicated. But
yeah, because we always, like, even just in general history, you always focus in on Caesar and Pompey and Mark Antony and Octavian and the rise of the Roman Empire. But Cicero is always there, and he's our major source for that time period too.
So in your journey through the classics and through undergrad and your graduate degree, how did you find Gilman, or how did you get to Baltimore? Because I know you're from Buffalo.
Yeah, I'm from outside of Buffalo, New York. So I was at UVA, and then I was knowing I was not going to finish my dissertation. I was ABD at that point, so all but dissertation. And I knew I wanted to transition into teaching in the independent school at that point. So I applied. That sort of my funding was running out, so I was like, I need to make that transition now. So I just started looking for independent school jobs, and then that year Gilman was posting, but I wasn't quite sure if I really wanted to teach in an all-boys school, not really understanding Gilman's situation with Bryn Mawr and RPCS. So I didn't originally send out an application to Gilman, but at that time, one of the former teachers, Dan Houston, I was on Carney Sando, the sort of search, the private school search sort of, company. And so Dan Houston just emailed me cold saying, we've seen your resume. Would you be interested in talking about Gilman School? I was like, okay. I wasn't having much luck at that point, finding a position in sort of areas where I would like to live. So Dan and I had a conversation, and it was clear, this be a perfect fit for the way I teach Latin, understanding better about sort of the scope of the class, actually having a classics department in an independent school and a high school is just remarkable. Usually the Latin teacher is just part of the modern language department at most schools. So that conversation with Dan was great. So then I sort of officially applied, and then my interview was 2 days after the Freddie Gray riots.
Oh, wow.
So a lot of my interview day was spent with people convincing me Baltimore's not usually on fire. We have our problems, but but that didn't deter me, because when I got into campus, even though everyone was sort of recovering and sort of understanding what had just happened, there were things like touring the campus. Toby took me around, and I remember I met Cheryl Nikeva, who's really fun and immediately kind of
great energy,
yeah, and sort of being here on campus immediately kind of this is a place to be. So
do you teach female students from Bryn Mawr and RPCS too? Or all your classes have the tri-school model in them?
Basically, all of my classes are or co-ed or tri-school, depending. I think this is my 6th year at Gilman. I've only had 2 classes, and they were both in my first year, that were all boys. Basically, every single class is always co-ed. Especially because the underclassmen, the 9th and 10th graders, in particular from RPCS, but now also from Bryn Mawr, are coming over to Gilman for Latin or Greek. They're not, whereas most of the students at Gilman, they don't experience the tri-school until they're juniors. But with classics is when we get them younger. So I often have 9th graders or 10th graders from all 3 schools in my classes.
So where do you begin, maybe in that that Roman class, right, or the first class that you take, beginners Latin, right? Where do you start the year off with these freshman students who maybe are just interested in the class and are jumping in there? What do you begin your curriculum with?
Just the basics, how to pronounce. So classical Latin, you pronounce, even though all the letters and the words even look like English, you pronounce it a little differently. And it's even different if you're Christian and you sing Latin songs or carols in church, or you have heard a Catholic sermon in Latin. Their pronunciation is different than sort of this more classical, quote unquote, Latin we want to teach, so we just start with the basics and then start from there, because Latin's an inflected language, so as we say, English word order doesn't matter. You could have the verb at the start of a sentence, you could have a verb at the middle of the sentence. The words change whether they're a subject or object based on the ending of the word. So just getting them out of the sort of habits of either English or even Spanish or the other languages they may know, that it's an inflected language. So you really have to pay attention to the endings of the words, because word order will not necessarily help you. You can't guarantee.
That's tough.
Yeah, you can't guarantee like the first word in your sentence will be a subject, although oftentimes it will. You can't guarantee that.
Is it just random, or just doesn't matter? Like the writers of Latin, they can just arbitrarily put a word in wherever, or
kind of, but we say like Latin doesn't have English word order, but there is Latin word order. There is patterns to what the Latin authors are writing. Those patterns can go out the window when we go to Latin poetry, where the word order is often dictated by the meter of the poem, so you have more jumbled of sort of placement of words, but there's still some patterns that emerge that you can understand. Oh, if I'm seeing this, I should expect this, and sort of just teaching those new ways of looking at sentences and words. So that's what I'm kind of most enjoyed about learning Latin, and what I try hopefully to impart on students is sort of really slowing down and looking at what you're actually reading and really thinking about what you're reading word by word. The words matter, and here in particular the endings matter, but just slowing down, whereas so much in our modern society is like sped up, or like everything is quick now, or instant.
Skim reading.
Yeah, skim reading or instant. And you can get to a point where you can skim read Latin as well when you know it enough, but just initially just slowing down is just a good thing in life. Like, you don't always want to be on the go. You want to slow down at points too.
For sure. And that will help them with their English or whatever language that they're taking. But as an English teacher, like we slow down our reading too. I've gotten to the point where I'd rather assign fewer pages of reading so they actually really engage with it and pay attention, because there's so many subtleties that you might miss if you're just trying to get those, 30 pages done.
Right. Yeah, like why did this author choose this word? And particularly in like Latin poetry, why did they place this word there? And why is it important that it's surrounding this other word? Like that all matters, especially in Latin poetry, like word placement, as it can affect actually the meaning and sort of imitate the meaning of the actual words. So,
who are some of the Latin poets that you discuss and study in your class?
So I teach 3 honors, so our major author is Ovid, who's writing under Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, and he's famous for his Metamorphoses because it's a bunch of myths that have been strung together. So a lot of myth stories. Ovid is a source for some of those, in particular like Pyramus and Thisbe, which is sort of a form of like Romeo and Juliet that Shakespeare is definitely looking to that earlier story when he's composing Romeo and Juliet. So sort of those stories which come out later in later authors. So
why did that? So I haven't studied that too much. I know we did read it in a class I took in college, but why did Metamorphoses stick around for so long? Why is it such a powerful work?
I think because it's a bunch of various different stories and the imagery is great, that a lot of first artists have taken up the Metamorphoses, and also poets have reread the Metamorphoses, especially, and approached it in different ways. Like there's a lot of feminist readings of the myths, because unfortunately, a lot of Greek and Roman mythology involves rape, and sort of you can't gloss over that as the sort of subject of the myth. So there's been very interesting artistic representation in modern day poetry approaches and sort of readings of these myths, and giving agency and voice to the female actors in the story. So yeah, so I think it's just that the imagery is such that artists immediately want to sort of try to recreate the story, and then other authors want to reread and want to sort of rework based on those stories.
Got it. Interesting. So in your experience here at Gilman, what do you most enjoy about teaching classics and Latin to not only the Gilman boys, but also to the students in the tri-school area. What have you really found has been fulfilling about this experience now that you're a teacher and you've decided on this profession? What do you like most about it?
I think it's still like when I said earlier, when suddenly the light bulb goes off on the student, it's still that. And everyone always says like Latin's so hard, and it can be, but it shouldn't prevent people from trying it, because it doesn't need to be any harder than any other language or any other new subject you're taking. But just seeing those connections, or when they make the connections, like some years we read the story of Pygmalion in Latin in Ovid, and they make the connection with when they read Frankenstein in English, like making those connections cross-subject, cross-disciplines has always been also kind of wonderful to see, how it can influence their studies in other subject areas as well.
Yeah, that's one thing that I've always known about Latin. I never took it in high school, but I always knew that as a person who loved English, like Latin could really help my like root words and understanding the English language better.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's maybe one of the reasons a lot of students might take Latin initially.
Yeah, it's true, because like over 50% of probably most English words are derived from Latin to a certain extent. So it does help with vocab. And I think that initially is what compels a lot of students to take it. They also do understand like it's connected with Spanish and French as the other Romance languages. So they can find connections there to help with vocabulary and things like that. So there is that. But then there's also maybe notoriously the way we teach Latin, we don't speak it as much. So often, sometimes students will choose Latin because they don't need to converse as much in Latin. Although you can teach Latin very effectively through like spoken Latin, and that is something I would like to improve upon. But definitely, there is also that kind of area where I don't need to converse as much, and I can really be slower and work through it, and that can help too, to choose Latin.
If you were going to teach one Latin poem or prose in one of your classes, what would you select? What is your favorite to teach the students?
That's tricky.
Metamorphoses, maybe?
It's the Metamorphoses is the text I've taught the most, both in college and here at Gilman. I'm very comfortable with the stories and teaching it and sort of talking about Ovid and getting them to understand how he's writing, why he's writing, and why it's not just myth stories strung together. There's a lot going on underneath the surface. So I enjoy teaching Ovid. There is probably... I also enjoy teaching Catullus, who's a Roman poet. He's probably my favorite of the Roman poets to read. He's also writing in the late Republic. He's earlier than Ovid. He's writing shorter poems. Some are also politically connected. He makes fun of Caesar in one of them. But they're also sort of love poetry as well, and they can get also pretty racy. So there's some of the poems which we may not necessarily teach at the high school level, but we definitely teach at the college level. So he's my favorite poet to read. So I have been able to teach him a couple times, but yeah, I always enjoy Catullus.
Yeah, you're at an interesting crossroads because you not only have to communicate and teach the language part, but also the writing style, the figure, the history. Like you have a lot of different elements to your curriculum that you kind of have to impart and walk the students through.
Yeah, and I don't think that necessarily is very different from like an English teacher where like
True.
When you're reading a new author in English, you want some context maybe to the story, or if it's set in a historical period, you need to provide some sort of context for the students. So it's very similar to that. But yeah, there's a lot. It's not just teaching a language. If you want to really enjoy the literature, you have to understand the context of the author, why they're writing, who they're talking about, and why is it important. So
So you do have Silk Roads. You brought in Silk Roads today.
Yeah.
I'm curious about this because this is a title that I've seen all over the place. I have the new Silk Roads book by the same author, but I've never read this one. Why did you select this one to bring in as your book recommendation?
So I knew we were going to be talking about Latin and sort of classics a lot, but it's also sort of limits sort of my knowledge. And this is kind of a feature of, to a certain extent, like modern education, especially in America. We get so focused on this terrible kind of thinking of like Greece to Rome to Western Europe to the US as a direct line of heritage, which is not true and is a very problematic way to look at history or look at the past or the foundation of America. So myself is like, I need to also better educate myself about sort of the larger history. That's why I so enjoyed my year in Greece, because we got exposed to the full history of Greece from like prehistory to modern, and that includes really understanding more about the interaction with the East, with Asia and Turkey, but going beyond that to India and whatnot, and the whole Mediterranean, looking at North Africa and Egypt and everything. So just sort of broadening out my sort of narrow scope of like certain 2,000 years, of maybe history that I know pretty well, but moving it into areas where I don't know. So I like this book because it starts with something that I do know, like with Greece and Alexander the Great, but then it immediately moves into the India and sort of all the like stands, Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, and sort of understanding better about the importance of what's called like the Byzantine, like what happens after Constantine sort of chooses Christianity from Rome and then moves the seat to Constantinople or Istanbul. And usually that's where, when you're studying Greece and Rome, that's usually where your history stops. But then there's so much more history before we get to like the Middle Ages, where usually European history picks up. But we forget about the sort of flourishing of the Persian Empire in this point, and sort of the power that is happening, struggles that are happening in the East that are really crucial to actually the Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire, and really understanding sort of that area more as sort of a whole in my knowledge that I really want to sort of build.
Yeah, I mean, you're expanding the holes in your knowledge, and yet you have all the the underpinnings of the ancient world. Pretty much, you've learned all those. You've studied that part, and when you were coming on the episode, I was looking into really what we were talking about today, and just thinking there's so much about the ancient world that I don't know and I haven't studied and I haven't spent time on, and that we take kind of for granted in our modern world, and we don't even think about like where does our language come from, and roads, and like who came up with all of these things that we use and to our advantage today in our waking life today.
Yeah, and just like even the things you do know, like Homer isn't really Greek. He has so much more connections to stuff in the East as an influence, like the Near East, that we forget that everything is not just a silo. Like there's just, especially in the ancient world, everything is influencing each other so much that it sometimes seems unmanageable how much you would need to learn to really understand history and understand how things get passed down. But I think that's a good thing, that you are constantly learning, constantly reading and expanding your knowledge and finding new connections between things you already know. So
yeah, it's less linear than it is kind of just an expanding web.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Everything's influencing each other, and these strings are pulling these strings too. And that's something that I was learning more about with ancient Rome, and how when they expanded the emperor, they were just adopting the new territories and the inventions and the ideas that they were conquering.
Yeah, it's that tension between appropriation, but also sort of adoption and sort of really understanding and really taking on those new values or new customs as well. So,
well, Sarah, thank you very much for coming on today. It was a great start to our conversation on this topic and what you teach here, and I'd love to continue this and have you on maybe again once I learn a little bit more and can have some more talking points about the ancient world. But fascinated with the subjects you teach, and definitely that book that you brought in too.
Yeah, thank you. I enjoyed speaking with you. So.
Awesome. Thank you.